So welcome everyone, and first of all, we'll look for a motion to approve the agenda or if there's any completions.
So moved.
Support. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right. Now we're going to move on to public comment, just so it's a little different tonight because excuse me, it's a work session and not an actual meeting. We're just discussing things. There's no decisions are being made whatsoever. We're just gonna talk about what's going on and talk about different ideas, and that's what tonight is about. So if anyone thought we're making any decisions, that is not the case. So anyway, but we're gonna open things to public comment. If you want to comment publicly, great, you just come up front. And please state your name if you don't mind. Then we'll start on the, I think we started on the left side last time, so we'll start on this side this time. You want to comment?
I think Howard had me presenting.
Oh, okay, wonderful. I thought I recognized you.
Yeah, okay.
Anyone else on this side? Come on up.
Thank you. Lauren Robinson, 17113 Lakeview Avenue. And I just wanted to say thank you for having this work session, first of all. And, you know, we have expressed before our love for the Quincy Street Road End access and how much we appreciate that this board is willing to put time and energy and effort into it. I just want to be here to say we as neighbors in this area would love to work out however we can, trying to keep this site available, accessible, and something that all of us can utilize. It is the only place for us that is in real walking distance, especially with our young ones. And so it does become a place that we frequent, and it is something that we want to keep accessible to our kids. So that's it. Thank you.
This side. All right, this side, second row.
Jackie Beck, 34 Hollywood. I just want to say I am in favor of, building the steps if that's what it takes. And hopefully, maybe there's like a cheaper option to do it, but I do think it's a valuable resource. And like she was saying, it's in walking distance for a lot of people, and being able to walk to the beach is important. Not everyone wants to get in their car and drive to go to the beach. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Morgan Nedick. I will kind of echo a lot of what Lauren said as my neighbor, representing the hundreds of people that signed that petition last time we talked about this, but just keeping this access site and maintaining it over the years for generations to come. So thank you for your work on all this.
Fifth row. Fifth row. How about the last row? All right, very good. Well, anyone else? Anyone? All right, we'll close public comment. All right, and you got to see the what was included in the packet there. And so apparently it's a little bit more involved than what we were hoping or expecting. So first of all, do you have any comments?
Yes, I would like to summarize the letter that is in front of you this evening. This letter was written this afternoon. Kevin and I, I met the loss control rep out there for our insurance company, the Michigan Municipal League. I apologize for rocking right at the end and being a little sweaty. I just came from my son's baseball game, so I left in the third inning. But essentially the summary of this letter is this. Right now, the path exists as a natural path to the water. The more improvements the township makes, and again, it's in the letter, so let the letter speak for itself, but absent reading the whole thing. The more improvements the township makes, the greater the liability. So when we move to putting in stairs, those stairs are going to have to be ADA accessible if that is the board's choice. Once we make that sort of accessibility, once we make that improvement, then we start looking at, okay, does the whole path have to be ADA accessible? As of right now, it's a natural path to the water. If we start looking at the accessibility along the whole length of the path, okay, given that, you know, the fence from Camp Geneva might be moved, now we're looking at cutting into some of those dunes and cutting into some of those slopes, which is significant cost. Given both the property constraints, but also the construction costs. So, you know, it is what it is, right? This is essentially, I think, the same thing I've been saying for quite some time in its current state as a natural path to the water. But as we begin to put in infrastructure, that infrastructure is going to have to be to the standards that is appropriate for a municipality. And that is essentially what the MML is telling you, which is our liability insurance carrier.
Yes, sir.
You were
Say something?
I didn't want to interrupt, but.
This is just a work session.
Good.
Please
Question.
Yeah.
Did he address the liability that we would extend or that we currently have with the property with our current policy? And what extent do we have there? Should someone get seriously injured on the property at this time in its current condition?
Okay, so he was very clear with me on the phone and also very clear with me on site that a assessment of liability is a legal analysis. Okay, he's not an attorney. And so he defers to legal counsel in that regard. He did indicate to me from a risk management perspective that yes, we do have liability in its current form. In its current form, it's a natural path to the water. As we start increasing infrastructure, physical infrastructure, increasing elements of improvement, we're going to need to bring that infrastructure and those improvements up to the standards that is appropriate for a municipal entity. And that's going to be ADA accessibility. You're essentially what he said, both anecdotally and, you know, kind of straightforward. As you improve, as you create more infrastructure, your liability is going to increase if you say, okay, well, we're going to do something here, but we're not going to do something over there. Right? So we're going to put in stairs here, and those stairs, he said, you put in those stairs, they have to be ADA accessible.
Okay,
Right.
I'm fine with that.
But-
Understand. My question relates to the property as it currently exists. If we do nothing, this is a risk manager consultant.
There's less risk if you do nothing because there's no infrastructure, but it's
My
not.
question related to what is our current liability exposure to that with our property, with our current
He can't.
policy?
He cannot give you that answer. He is not an attorney. And
He's a loss control consultant.
okay, I'm gonna
Is he with the corporation that we currently have policy with?
I'm gonna defer to Mr. Martin. He can only give him. He can only.
He's a risk manager, is he not?
He is. He
Can
says.
we not assess the exposure we have on the property as it exists today?
He said there is less exposure on the property as it exists today and more exposure as the improvements go in, if those improvements are not to the standards of ADA accessibility and current state and federal law.
And my follow-up question then is, does our policy currently cover that property as we have it existing?
Yes,
Thank
our
you.
policy does currently cover it. And yes, we do currently have liability on that property.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other comments on this letter? Do we have a question? So numbers here. So you're anticipating 35 to 50,000. When you say June stabilization, what's it?
So I think the 35 to 50,000, that may even be quite low at this point. And I see Lucas in the audience and he's shaking his head that he thinks it's low. That number came from Camp Geneva. Camp Geneva put some stairs in a number maybe a year or two ago. And that number that came from that. We would have to do engineering on those stairs. My guess is those stairs are probably going to need to be aluminum as opposed to wood because they're going to need to be pretty much there on a permanent basis. There'll need to be ADA accessibility stairs, which is probably going to add cost. The dune stabilization is planting of the dune. So it's unlikely that Eagle is going to allow us to just put sand on the dune. They're now going to say you have to vegetate the dune, which means that you're either talking about dune grass or you're talking about some kind of other type of vegetation. And I am not qualified to know. I know that there are dune vegetations. I know that Camp Geneva just recently went through this. Eagle and Lucas, correct me if I'm wrong, just go ahead, please. But Eagle is essentially saying, we may let you put in sand, may let you do it once, and we may not. And even if we do let you put in sand, we probably want you to put in stairs anyway. And so at this point, because the township's not going to do any of these kind of improvements without verifying and going through the process with Eagle first. All of the improvements on that property, on that access point, didn't require a permit except for the sand. I don't agree with it, but that is what it is. So, us creating posts and putting rope through posts wasn't going to require a permit. The cutting down of the tree, as long as we did it at the base and not below the root line, was not going to require a permit. Little stairs in the front, not going to require a permit. It's potentially even that the stairs themselves may not require a permit, but we're not going to be allowed to put that sand in. And if they do allow it on a sort of one-time basis, and it would have to go in front of one of their committees, they basically indicated, hey, we probably won't allow it again. And if we do let you do it, you're going to have to do engineering on how that dune is going to be landscaped, stabilized, and you're going to have you're going to have to do engineering on cross sections of the dune, which means that we're doing a lot more work than we initially anticipated.
Oh, excuse me, are we allowed to make comments? There's a work session.
Well, I guess not, because we had public comment and I've closed public comment.
Well, we have comments about what's being discussed and we couldn't have made those comments before the discussion took place.
I hear what you're saying, but maybe you can give those comments by email to all the board members.
We saw the email brought a number of times. Question, Howard bringing up the ADA requirement, and there is an exception in ADA where meeting those requirements are not structurally feasible. And when you're talking about putting stairs in a access site that's only 12 foot wide, it is pretty impractical to think you can also add a ramp in there. So I don't think the ADA would apply because I think it meets that exception. And also the cost that he is referencing from Camp Geneva was $35,000. But Kevin also mentioned in that letter that he had that stairway has 3 avenues.
Sir,
We would have none.
I hear you. My engineer thinks that my number is significantly low. So Lucas, what do you think the estimate of engineered, you think it's low or high?
Yeah, I think it would be low, especially if, and I have a presentation, I'd be glad to present with some more
Yeah.
information.
Please do.
Yeah.
Plus the vertical height is about half of what the stairs that can be recorded. So I'm not sure you're comparing apples to apples with financial.
Lucas, why don't you come up and
Yeah,
give
it'd be
us
fine.
100%?
Yeah, thank you. Nice to see you again, board. So, name's Lucas Timmer, work with Prine and Newhoff, civil engineer, do a lot of work with Eagle permitting, and some of the challenges that we have with that type of permitting. So everyone generally in the audience knows where this access is. You can see here, it's that red line, 12 feet wide, about a little more than 2 football fields long. So it's over 600 feet to the beach, just on the north end of Camp Geneva. So back in October of 2023, we were asked by Park Township to survey the site. So if you've been out there, you'll see some stakes with some pink laths showing where the north property line is. You can see here on the certified survey where the fence for Camp Geneva is located. I'll go into a little more detail on that relative to where that is relative to the property line. So everyone here is generally aware of the issues, right? And one of the big issues that you guys are having here is with erosion, right? So as you access the beach, some significant erosion has happened over time. I'm guessing members of the audience have seen how this area has changed over time. And one of the unfortunate things about the location of this area, and is in a sense it's in a gully, right? So you have ridges and you have gullies. So this area in general, if you look at the contour map, you can see kind of the U shapes that's going down to the water. So this is an area that concentrates stormwater and rainwater. So in the sense of the flow path for water to go from the dune area down towards Lake Michigan. So this is one of the reasons why, besides wind, besides use, that you're having those erosion issues. Other issues that you guys have on site include that large white pine tree, I believe. You can see that on the photo to the right there, and it is kind of in a precarious position. It's got a nice strong root system doing well, but there are obviously some concerns with that, and I know interest from the township on getting rid of that tree. So other issues that you have is just the size, right? You have a 12-foot wide area to get to the beach. And from our survey, what we noticed is Camp Geneva's fence is anywhere from 2.5 feet to 6.5 feet about into their own property. And in the current state, there are a lot of areas where that path then, where people use for access, is on Camp Geneva's property. You can see from the photos here, the path is right next to the fence, right? So there are areas currently that, in a sense, is on private property being used for access. Other issues obviously are the neighbor to the north, where those red boxes show some stakes that we put out there. So other concerns, obviously, with this area is just the 12-foot access, right? Not much area for people to go to the beach. You can still access the beach. Dan can probably speak up to it more on shoreline laws, but there are areas where you are in public property and where you're in private property, right on the beach, which everyone's familiar with. Also, if you go out there, you can see areas with significant brush kind of piled up from the trees in there. So, for you guys to do anything here, we need to understand how this area is regulated, right? So, wetlands are regulated, streams are regulated, work on the Great Lakes is regulated. The state has regulations in place for both critical dunes and high-risk erosion areas. So I'll go into a little detail on both. So the critical dunes came about in 1989. There were concerns as development continued to happen on dunes, how that would impact dune resources. So the state then came up with Part 353 of the National Resource and Environmental Protection Act to protect sand dunes. So with that, the whole area along Quincy Street there is considered critical dunes. So it goes from Lakeshore Drive in a sense all the way to the beach. So critical dune permits are required whenever there's an activity that significantly alters the dune. So anything that changes grade, right? So if you're changing grade, adding sand, making a new path, that is considered regulated under critical dunes, or permanent structures, right? It's another way how dunes are regulated. So the other thing is high risk erosion areas. So we are all familiar with 2020. You guys, it's a board probably, or unfortunately more familiar with it than other boards, but this is also an area of high risk erosion. So it's worth noting that in this area, the rate of change over 30 years, they anticipate that the bluff over 30 years is going to move 90 feet. So on that map, you can see that that dune will continue to change by 90 feet over 30 years for what Eagle anticipates. And over 60 years, it'll change 165 feet. So This is also an area where the dunes are alive and changing, and they are, as we've seen, receding in size, right? So, with high risk erosion areas, the state also requires permitting under Part 323. So the state has more concerns under this act on permanent structures. So they have concerns with homes. You don't want a house falling in, or a septic system, or a well. Lots of concerns on things like stairs, which we'll go into more detail later. So here's essentially a list on what things need a permit and what things don't need a permit. So you can see here things that generally need a permit for really the things that you would consider as improvements, like a fence or some form of grading or spoils disposal or vegetation removal. You can see high risk erosion area. Essentially all of those, you don't need a permit for that because they're more concerned about the house or the other permanent structures. However, for critical dunes, you can see that in all those situations, you do need a permit with some exceptions, which I'll go into detail here. So the state gives exceptions for the construction of stairways. So if you have a construction of a stairway that's 5 feet wide, doesn't have any sort of decks, kind of like what Camp Geneva's has, it's just your 5-foot stairway with a landing up top and a landing on bottom, and your only impact is the vegetation within that 5-foot stairway, you're allowed to put that in under the critical dune law without needing a permit. So other exceptions include removal of trees. So that one we talked about, that large white pine tree, right, that's overhanging the edge. If you remove that tree but keep the root system intact, you are allowed to do that without the need for a permit. Versus if you're going through there and clear cutting and removing stumps, that's when you need a permit for the state. The last thing is a fence. So you guys are allowed to put in a fence if it allows sand to move. So your typical nautical fence with a rope, that's a great example of a fence allowing sand to move. It also mentions a cyclone fence, which essentially is your standard chain link type fence that allows sand to migrate. So what wouldn't be allowed is a wooden fence, right, where sand can't move. So essentially the projects that you guys are looking at, right, we're installing a nautical style fence. We said you're allowed to do that. Removing a large tree overhanging, you're allowed to do that, so you need to keep the roots. Installing sand in the erosion gully area with like a sand blower truck, so it'd be a truck that has a long hose and it blows sand in, that does require a permit. That's a grading change of that dune. Even though that dune had eroded over time, unfortunately, that's still, because you're bringing in fill, the state views that as needing a permit, right? So as Howard mentioned, with this, because you're putting in fill, your permit isn't your typical critical dune permit. It actually requires a next level of permitting. So your typical critical dune permit is a $250 permit. This is an additional $2,000 on top of that if you're putting in fill. And you have to go to a special panel besides the permit that looks at what you're doing, and they have to approve then the work you're doing. Obviously time takes longer too, the more people are involved, right? So the permit takes longer. And as Howard mentioned, this would require significantly more surveying than what I think was anticipated at first. So next slide here, we reached out to Eagle. There's Eagle representative in the Grand Rapids office of critical dunes. And they mentioned essentially that the special, without telling us, like Howard said the word may, right? So I want to keep using that word because we don't have true answers till we go through this process. But essentially what they're saying is you may or likely would need stabilization measures. So those pictures to the right show examples of that. So that's putting down like a blanket on the dunes and growing dune grass. Or that's using these things called core logs, which are these kind of straw-based logs that you put on dunes and you pile them up, and then you could grow dune grass on them. So that's going to be a potential requirement. Planting's also a requirement. And what they indicated too is that a stairwell would still likely be needed on top of all this stabilization work, because thinking in the head of Eagle, they don't want you to put in sand necessarily every year and then have people go on it, rain, it gets washed out, and then you have to just keep putting more sand in. They want to solve the problem in a sense now. So that, like Howard said, I mean, they could, the exception panel could have a completely different opinion than the reviewer. We don't know, but she at least fortunately gave us an idea of what we should expect and the level of effort that you guys need to put in to this. Eagle also indicated that they may only approve a one-time approval of fill. So this area is kind of a gully. There's a lot of stormwater that goes through there. So there could be erosion in the future. There could be challenges in the future then with getting sand back there potentially. They could approve it again under certain circumstances. They could not. So moving on, one way that Eagle said, which changed backwards a little bit to me, but Eagle said you could avoid getting a permit if you throw in that 5-foot stairway, right? So you throw in that stairway, which as that area erodes over time, you're gonna probably have to keep moving that stairway as the dune keeps moving, right? But Eagle, in a sense, because there are enough properties, you know, people on the dunes and they need access to the lake, they allow stairways under certain requirements. If it's 5 feet or less, it only disturbs vegetation within the footprint. And there are then only entry and exit platforms, so no platforms. So that's a way to not get a permit, but that's a small stairway. That stairway doesn't meet, you know, ADA compliance, right? But it's just your standard stairway down to the beach, right? So so that's kind of the background, I guess, on some of this. Hopefully that was informative, but yeah, any questions or?
So it,
Go ahead.
sorry. So if we would just put in a basic stairway, we wouldn't have to be ADA compliant?
I'm not making that, I have an engineer hat, not an attorney hat.
So,
Dan would probably-
so let me read this letter. It says,
I did.
okay, all right, so for everybody in the room, any installation or construction of improvements by the township on this, I'm gonna go one more sentence above it. In the current state, the property represents the least amount of risk as land owned by the township. While a walking path does exist on the property, it could be considered an unimproved natural area that may be used by the public at their own risk. Any installation or construction of improvements by the township on this piece of property would begin to increase the possible liability associated with the land. Depending on the final details, the more involved the improvements, the greater the possible risk to the township. So let me just repeat. The loss control agent is not an attorney. He's not going to tell you definitively the stairs have to be X or the stairs can't be Y. He's going to say the more infrastructure you put on the property, the more likely your liability is, and the more you are going to need to ask the question, are we, because now it's a municipal piece of property, we are acknowledging and putting in resources to that property. And now we are saying we are inviting the public into that property. And so when we invite the public into that property, then we have to have a level of safety for that property that is appropriate for it. The gentleman in the back may be correct. It may be that we can put in stairs and those stairs 5 feet don't have to have a ramp, don't have to technically be ADA accessible. At that point, you're going to have to ask yourself a legal question and a risk control analysis question that if the stairs go in, is now the path appropriate for people to get to the stairs? You as a municipality, look, at the end of the day, folks, I'm not advocating one way or another. I'm just giving you the facts to best protect the municipal entity and to give you the best information I can. So you put in the stairs, and so then we're going to have to ask the question, is then a risk control agent going to say it is either appropriate or not appropriate to then deal with the slopes along the dune? Because once the fence gets moved from Camp Geneva, then we have areas along that path where people potentially would be walking along a very steep slope. And I'm not so much worried about the stairs as much as I am, do the stairs then create a greater amount of liability? We've improved the access now, we've added resources to it, and do we have an expectation that there's a basic level of safety that has to be provided for the path to get to the stairs.
You didn't answer the question. The question was, do the stairs have to be ADA compliant? That was the question.
Is that a Dan question?
There are kind of two different questions that you're talking about. One is risk of liability. One is compliance with federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Generally speaking, anytime you make improvements in facilities, you have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act to make them handicapped accessible. There may be an exception. In this instance, I would have to actually research that in more detail. Even if there is an exception, you still then have the policy question of, do you want to, in a sense, exclude people with disabilities from public accommodation? One of the things that Howard is raising is the issue of, even if you put the steps along the beach and or a ramp on the beach, how does somebody get to it when you've only got 12 feet through wooded area and a slope? The risk of liability, and I will say, I don't know whether David Sperry is a licensed attorney or not. I will take Howard's word for it that he's not. He does have a law degree.
Oh, I didn't know if he was an attorney or not. I just
Yeah.
knew that he was our risk controller.
Okay. When you look at the various initials after his name, which are quite few, the first two are JD, meaning Juris Doctorate, meaning he went and graduated from law school. He may not be a licensed attorney. But the liability issue is, you are a governmental entity, so that cuts both ways. You are obligated by law to comply with the ADA when you build facilities. And putting the stairs or a path would be a facility. What it's not is a building. The reason I say that is the definition of a building under the Tort Act with governmental immunity requires a roof. And so you wouldn't be creating a building, so you should still have governmental immunity with respect to the risk of liability, at least for the stairs. When you put in the path, an argument might be made that the path is a sidewalk if it's paved, and to be handicapped accessible, it would more likely than not be paved because it's adjacent to or connected to the roadway. It could be considered a path, it could be considered a sidewalk. If it's considered a sidewalk, you would lose governmental immunity for that portion. If it's considered a path, you could still have governmental.
I'll just add, and I realize that this is a tough question to answer to both Mr. Supervisor and to Trustee DeHaan. There's ADA. The law of ADA is not necessarily absolute. It is an issue of risk liability, which is why I cannot answer it. Sure, there may be an exception to the stairs. And the entity of Eagle may say, okay, you can put in the 5-foot stairs and those stairs don't have to be ADA accessible because of an exception. That does not change the liability side of it. So if you build a building, we build a building and we don't put handicapped parking spaces out there. It's not that there's something that is created where we've, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not a legal issue at that point. It becomes a liability issue at that point. Somebody then can sue you and say, you're not complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's what, every time I ask, that's the answer that I get back. And so I'm not giving you a definitive answer as, is it legal or is it not? Is it required or is it not? Everybody tells me it's an issue of liability analysis.
There are two separate analyses. There's the liability and risk of liability, then there's the ADA compliance. The liability, if you will, under ADA compliance is that you haven't complied with ADA. So the issue is, do you have to comply with it? To me, that becomes a yes or no answer, not a gray area. I would have to look more to make sure there is or is not an exception for you putting in a new facility to not comply with the ADA. So for example, when you build the pickleball courts or when you build a new community center, that is going to have to be ADA compliant, period. These stairs, there may be an exception that might apply. We would have to do a little more research. The liability issue is more again under the governmental immunity because you're liable for torts. Injuries that might occur to your residents or invitees, as Howard was talking about, but generally speaking, the township's gonna have liability. There are certain exceptions to governmental liability, such as the public highway exception, public building exception, motor vehicle exception, those types of things. I don't think that there's going to be an exception that applies. Potentially, the sidewalk exception might. But then again, it might not, because more likely than not, this would actually be a pathway. So the risk of like a multi-million dollar lawsuit against the township for an injury that occurs from somebody going on the path or falling down the stairs, the township's gonna have governmental immunity. The risk of you putting in a facility that doesn't comply with the ADA, if there's an exception, there's no risk of liability. If you don't have the exception, there's the risk that you didn't do it right. You would be liable for violating the Americans with Disabilities Act, discriminating on account of disability. Court's gonna require you to pay monetary damages and put it in ADA compliant.
Thank you, Dan. And my apologies for not being as knowledgeable as Mr. Martin on this issue.
Just an observation that it starts to become a policy decision versus maybe we put stairs in, you know, so having just traversed the property in the last 3 hours. If the fence is moved and the path is moved, you have to be a fairly able-bodied person.
Right.
To move through that property.
Right.
And to cut a path on the side of a hill in a dune is a difficult. That's a difficult decision for me to make. I would have a hard time saying, "Hey, let's go that path." No pun intended. But I think that's a hard. This is really quite hard because we have trespassed for the last how many years on the Geneva property, on a very smooth property next to the fence, and they have every right, as any private property owner, to move their fence to the proper area. And whether they so do that, that's up to them. It's not our decision. But it does create a very difficult path to navigate. You hope it have great stairs. I'm confident we can probably get a nice stair in there. That's great. But getting to the stairs, but you're really violating, in some sense. You're not violating this. You're actually having to say, okay, are we okay with isolating access to folks who are actually significantly able to traverse difficult property? Today, you can walk down, but boy, you gotta be, Jan, I don't know.
It's on a hill,
It's
yeah.
on a hill, and honestly, it's not something I take my 3-year-old grandson down. I mean, it'd be risky for he and I today to take a visit down there.
You can get down, but you can't get up.
Can't get done, and then it creates a different situation that is difficult. So anyways, I'm struggling with this. I mean, I think this is a great discussion. We don't have to spend a nickel on it tonight. Well, obviously we're not, but I think it's a good discussion because it does create there's no yes or no on this. It's a complex issue, and to me, it's more policy than, hey, let's put stairs in. It's are we okay with that? I don't know. And without a couple of our board members piping in, I'd love to hear.
I feel the same. It's like a neighborhood pathway. There's no parking or anything. We don't, we don't want, it's just a quaint little place.
Yeah.
And I don't want to take it away from the neighbors. But on the other hand, I don't want to spend a lot of money and make it noticeable and jump all the hoops through that either. But that's just how I feel.
What's gone, you guys take it away from us, it's gone.
But we're not talking about taking it away. We're just talking improvements.
There wasn't any talk about.
There was no talk
There's
about
no
it.
talk.
Maybe decades ago, but never since I've been as a supervisor.
I think it was publicly talked about, not by the board. People.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So anyway, I have a question, Dan, because I didn't understand really your,
Sure.
understand a lot of, how this fit together. Are you saying if you put stairs in, you would have to make a path or no?
No, not necessarily. In one of the examples that I think might hit close to home, for example, in terms of ADA compliance would be like Mount Pisgah. You know, it's not like they put an elevator
Right.
to make it ADA compliant. I think a similar type of situation might be here, but I cannot say definitively tonight because I haven't researched it, that you wouldn't have to make any access to that beach ADA compliant. I think there is a possibility that you could put in stairs without having to make a path so that people could get up and down from the path. But if by putting in a facility such as stairs, it requires ADA compliance, then there would also have to be a ramp. You might not be able to get a ramp within 12 feet back and forth down there in a safe manner. But if you did, then you would have to make access from the roadway, Lakeshore Drive, to the stairs and ramp so that it would be ADA compliant. But again, I don't think you have to do that. I mean, my immediate reaction is you may not have to do that. Yes, generally facilities require it, but I don't know that it is practically possible given the 12-foot width, given the slopes, and given the idea of making access to the beach. There are a multitude of places within the township where there is access for people with disabilities.
Mhm.
But I don't think, Jim, the mere fact that you put in steps means now you have to make the entire path compliant. Unless ADA is gonna require that those steps to also have a ramp that is ADA compliant.
Is that something you can research for us?
Yes.
So, right, so in my mind, there's different, I mean. As far as whether you put stairs in, I think some of it is dependent on whether it has to be ADA compliant and whether we have to make a path that's ADA accessible. In my mind. And then I think there is a policy issue of risk. Does it increase risk that much that it's bad for the township? I don't know. That's what we would have to figure out. I think if you have to make it ADA accessible, which is not up to us, I think that does affect, one, it affects the cost of things, but it does affect the risk of things as well. So, I mean, that's ultimately a policy issue that the board wants to assume the township wants to accept as far as risk goes.
Mhm.
But as far as just the neighbors, I mean, there's a neighbor to the south, there's a neighbor to the north. I mean, it has to be something that is, doesn't impinge on them, because if it starts impinging on them, in my mind, then we've done a disservice to the neighbors. And I think anyone that uses that needs to understand that's private property.
Mhm.
And doesn't belong to them, and they shouldn't be on that property. So that's kind of where I'm at. I think we need to find some more things out, but before I could make a decision, but I think to put in sand and put in plantings and all of that is way too expensive for the township. Township has other things we'd like to spend money on than sand. But as far as the stairs, if it can be done inexpensively and doesn't lead to other consequences, which it might, then that's a whole other story.
Mhm.
I mean, that's what I think we need to figure out. That's where I'm at. So. What other comments?
Yeah, Mr. Supervisor, I'd like to kind of go back to my comments about our risk exposure here, and I saw Dan kind of smile with it. Dan, can you clarify our immunity that we currently have with the property as it exists? And I kind of forget that municipalities have some of the immunity. And so as a result, I'm back in my corporate world.
In its natural state, you have governmental immunity. When you start making improvements, you're going to have risks, one of complying with ADA and or other state and federal laws, including the permitting that's been talked about, including ADA that's been talked about in the letter. There's that risk of complying with those laws. And when, depending on the type of improvements that you're putting in, there creates more risks of liability because you might step outside of the umbrella of governmental immunity. So for example, like your pickleball courts, you'll have governmental immunity for that. Because they are not buildings, they're not highways, they're not motor vehicles, there's nothing on the exception for governmental immunity. Somebody's out there and they tear their rotator cuff playing pickleball, it's an assumption of the risk, there's no governmental immunity. If the court's a little bit sloppy, even that, you should have governmental immunity because it's not a sidewalk. Sidewalks where there are gaps, there's the exception for governmental immunity. Somebody trips over a crack in the sidewalk, there's the potential risk of liability. Pickleball court shouldn't be like that. Now, depending on what you do here, you like try to put in a gazebo and there's a roof over it and suddenly it's a building, there's an exception to governmental immunity. As it is right now, in its natural, unimproved state, you should have very, very little risk of any liability. Because you've got governmental immunity and no exceptions.
It gets a little complicated as you were talking, Steve, and the fact that because the path currently is on private property, and to create a path that's on our property, it will be extremely expensive because we're cutting into the dune, as you shared, but it also creates a little bit of a dilemma in terms of liability. If they would trip on the path, is Camp Geneva having risk exposure there? And I would say they do.
Yeah, so the irony is with Camp Geneva's fence being where it is, the path being on Camp Geneva's property, it's a trespass. It's not like the township is trespassing. Residents and visitors to the township are on Camp Geneva property. Camp Geneva is a nonprofit organization, not a governmental entity. It doesn't have governmental immunity. It could have premises liability, especially if they are inviting people onto this path. I don't think Camp Geneva is inviting them, so they're not necessarily invitees as opposed to people on the opposite side of the fence coming to the pool, etc. But there is that potential risk for Camp Geneva. I'm not their lawyer, so I'm not going to give any advice as to whether there's risk of liability.
But it complicates the issue of just leaving it the way it is. Because we're really saying, okay, you can use the path where it's at, if we're not doing anything. And I'm a little concerned about that, to be quite frank. You know, whether or not we need to put ropes in there so that they know that they're on property. Maybe that's something we need to think about. I'm not sure.
Ropes and to delineate the property lines.
Yeah.
That's already in the planning stages.
They're moving the fence.
Oh, they are.
I mean, the whole reason,
The fences, that's not.
After all these years of everybody doing what they wanted, now they're gonna move the fence. That's something to do. How many years have you people been walking down that path? 30, 40, 50?
I know some people.
Well, I just say, sometimes.
That's not our issue.
correct. Whether or not the fence is moved is not the township's issue. It's a private property issue. Okay, so
But the concern about the liability Geneva has goes away once they move their fence, that it won't be possible to walk on their property.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
That is absolutely
And
correct.
they have determined they are going to move their fence, correct?
from the township's perspective, the township was planning on adding a little bit of improvement to the front of the access point. The posts and the rope between those posts to delineate the northern property line. Cut down the tree that is at the very base of the dune. And now we are going to have to take down additional trees. There are trees there that need to come down. There's literally a tree down right there that I will be informing maintenance tomorrow that it is first priority to remove it. It is a widowmaker. It has already fallen and it is a very large limb that is being supported by a tree limb that big. Okay, there's another tree when the loss control risk person was there, it is completely dead. There is no bark on the tree. There is no leaves on the tree, and it is right on the path. These are the things that, you know, when you're a risk control person and you're walking and you're asking, the township that asked you to assess the risk, this is what's going to be pointed out. So those are going to have to come down as well. We were going to make those improvements, and in order to make those improvements, we submitted a permit to make sure, just in case we needed to do anything relative to those improvements that would be required under the Eagle permit. We actually thought, ironically, that the bringing in the sand would not be as big of an issue, and that the biggest issue would be putting in the posts with the rope. Turns out that that's not the case. Okay, that now we've got a bigger issue, and the bigger issue becomes the sand that was going to go down to the water to create a nicer slope for folks to walk on. Because clearly the most critical issue and part of this path is right at the edge of the dune where it's significantly rutted out. And you can theoretically go down it, although not very easy. And I certainly wouldn't recommend it if you didn't have, you know, if you weren't a very fit, healthy person, because, you know, you're literally walking on logs. They're perched on a dune. And then how you get back up is a different question entirely. So when we made that permit request to Eagle, this is what we got back. So then as the township representative, I then say, okay, what do we got here from a liability perspective? I ask our liability insurance carrier, okay, to come out and assess the property. They sent out their risk control person that is a person that consults for municipalities that has the insurance from the MML, the Michigan Municipal League, and this is the letter that we received. And so the information that I'm giving you all and giving to this board is what I have been told. I'm not an expert in ADA. I'm not an expert on the exceptions that you noted, and I'm not an attorney. At the end of the day, from my perspective, I just want to make sure the board understands the liability. I agree that doing nothing creates the least amount of liability. And I think the standpoint of doing nothing is not necessarily the rope and the delineation of the property line or a little bit of improvement in the front. I went over that with the risk control agent, and he indicated he did not think that that would add that much liability. It might add a little bit of liability because we're adding a little bit of infrastructure, but not much because it's still a natural path to the water. And we can still make the argument that it's a natural path, go at your own risk. He was concerned, and that's why I said to the board and had the conversation about the stairs, and that's what's in this letter, okay? So we'll run that down, but I agree that doing the minimal in terms of infrastructure would reduce the township's liability. That being said, the residents have also indicated that it needs to be improved because they can't get down and get back up.
We just wanted to get.
Improvements would be great, but that's not what, I mean, we just.
Okay. So the other issue is when the fence gets moved, okay, we're going to shift the path, and that path now is going to be on slopes.
Long fence, once that fence. We just got that.
Can I speak up on that?
Please.
So, with making a new path, you'd have to get a permit from the state because you're changing the contours of the grading. So that would be.
And like it is now, you're just walking in the center.
Walk path is.
Yeah, you could walk. I'm just saying that there's concerns with, I want to make sure the board knows that too. There are major concerns if you're shoveling, grading. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. That needs to be.
We're not bigger, no, we're just gonna move branches.
Yeah.
Any other comments from the board?
Just a question, did we get a permit to be able to put sand on the end of James Street?
No, no, we did not. That was done under the, number one, that would have been an exception. We've gone over this. That would have been an exception at the time that was done, because of the high erosion. or the high water and the erosion that was going on. That's one part of it. Secondly, it's not in a high-risk erosion area, and nor is it in a protected dune.
So it's not in a critical dune, not regulated, no.
Wow.
So did all those homes right there have the
Right, any other comments from the board?
Yeah, the question, if I can just add, is the Riley Road in a critical dune?
I can look up on the map, but.
Okay,
Or if we go to.
you get a chance.
The other point is, if we're gonna bring up the issue of road ends, I wanna be clear, the difference between road ends and this property. And I want the board to be clear on this and hear it. Well,
Which, okay, you can go ahead, what's your point?
the point is that we own this property. Road ends are owned by the road commission, technically. So that's why there's a change in liability.
Are you sure on that? Understanding is property is owned by
They own them.
All right, is there any other comments from the board? Okay, all right. We'll go to board comments then. Jan?
I have nothing.
Steve?
It may seem odd. I did, during my little break away on my vacation, I had a chance to read this fine document. And I just want to say, Terry, if you can pass on to the team, well done.
Yeah.
Well done. This is a well-crafted document. I appreciated the appendixes and the support documents that kind of drove, some of the decisions and some of the strategies. So I appreciate you including that type of stuff in, because it kind of, as you run through the first third of it, you kind of go, hey, here's the plan. Behind it was the why. And so well done. I did not read all these comments. I mean, to include all these comments, I was a bit overwhelmed when I started to sneak into there, but well done. I think the question during this public comment period, when it's out for public and other municipalities, is it appropriate at the next couple board meetings that you would highlight the particular sections that were changed or maintained, just for us as a board to understand? I mean, you have kept us informed along the way, but I'm just thinking, I read it one way, Jim, you're gonna read it one way, Jan, you're gonna read it another way. But is it appropriate to have maybe take a third over the next 3 months to just talk about this fine document?
I'll consider that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's something for us to truly understand.
Yeah, I certainly could support that. And as you remember, when we met just 2-3 weeks ago, that I said, as you read through it, think about the impacts to us as a board and to Park Township of the report itself. And so it just doesn't get buried. We know that there's a lot that's going to come out of that. Things that we need to consider, things that we need to think about and deliberate on, as well as make decisions on. And so I think your thought could well be helpful to us in that regard. I happen to be in a social environment today where the planning director for Holland Township, or I'm sorry, the city of Holland, was actually at our table. And he said that, yeah, they've looked at it. And I said, would you just send us a letter that you've done that, and any of the comments that came up out of that, not just, forget about it, because we didn't really have, he basically said, we didn't have any input to it. And I said, well, just tell us that then, So anyway, all that to say, I think I was remiss in our meeting 3 weeks ago, of following up on a little bit of Jim's comments of expressing appreciation to Mika and the team for putting a good job together. And I did that obviously with the PC at our last meeting that Mika had distributed, and it's really well received. And so, yeah, I think it's a phenomenal document. It really is. And I happen to have my copy here too, because it's interesting is that goal number 6 is improve the public's visual and physical access to the waterfront, which is right on target with what we discussed today, right? We did desire want to do that, but when it's practical, we want to do it.
All right, then. Do you have any comments, Manager Fink? Okay, all right. All right, all those, well, we'll look for a motion to adjourn.
No, I had one question. So not seeing much, please, ask the question, please.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So fencing is in. Pouring was supposed to occur today. I saw them actually probably prepping the site for pouring. I don't know that pouring actually occurred. That's
in the middle.
Yep,
Okay.
yep, that's the middle and the path up to it.
Okay.
Next week, we should have etching. I think there's another improvement before the acrylic goes down, and then the following week, the acrylic. So we should be middle of June playing pickleball. And then it's going to be weather dependent on how long it takes for the acrylic to dry. Okay. So I don't have an answer yet on how long it's going to be for the acrylic to dry, but I'm hoping middle of June at this point. So you should all take a walk out there, see the improvements. The water fountain came in, the drinking fountain. So that'll be going in along with the rest of the site. We're working, you see that most people are, the maintenance crew, mostly Ryan, is mowing the whole site now. That is preparing for an herbicide treatment or pesticide treatment, herbicide treatment. Thank you. An herbicide treatment to kill off all the invasive species, and then following in this fall, we will vegetate that whole site. We made a decision that the detention areas will be vegetated with natural wildflowers, and then I will be talking with Jim and a few folks on some landscaping around the pickleball courts. We really are trying to minimize the amount of maintenance on that site. And so we're trying to go with landscaping that is, no mow landscaping type stuff, but we can talk about some of those details later. We do have some dates on some pickleball tournaments. One of the dates has been set and we're waiting on the Township's date for pickleball. Brian, I think you're maybe a day or two away from that. It's set. So we'll have 2 dates. I'll go ahead and email that out to everyone tomorrow with a manager's report update with all the things I just talked about. That should be all the updates.
Any other questions? All right, we'll look for a motion to adjourn. Second. Discussion, hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Hearing none.
Yeah.